So people are possessed by a question, and it's part of our nature to be possessed by this question. And so you can think about this as an archetypal question, if you like. And the question is, what are we doing here? And so there's something about the very nature of human being that makes us feel as if something needs to be set right. When that's being discussed historically, it's been associated with the term redemption. People are in need of redemption. In the modern age, we talk about positive psychology, and we talk about happiness, which is a much weaker word. But our forefathers had a more profound sense of the problematic state of human existence, and they used more profound words. And the idea that we have a need for redemption is a more profound idea. Human beings, and I'm going to talk mostly about human beings in the West because that's the literature that I'm most familiar with. Human beings in the West have been meditating on the nature of human being for thousands of years. What happens in Genesis is that when people become self-conscious, when they eat the fruit, their vision improves, the scales fall from their eyes, and all of a sudden they can see in a way that no other animal has ever seen. And one of the things they can see is that they're naked, and that's a big problem. And you might ask, well, what does being naked mean? And that's quite straightforward. People often dream, for example, of being naked in front of a crowd. And to be naked in front of a crowd is to have all your frailties and vulnerabilities revealed to judgment. And that's a nightmare for people. And so to become self-aware is to wake up into a nightmare. And the nightmare involves a profound realization of individual vulnerability. And the consequence of that in Genesis is that people are banished from paradise and are from then on in need of redemption, and that they have to work. And that's how man comes to be in a fallen state. And you don't have a need for redemption or a need for meaning or a quest after meaning unless you're in a fallen state. And everyone, strangely enough, has this intuition that they're in a fallen state, that something is wrong with the world that needs to be put right, and more than that, or something is wrong with being and needs to be put right, and more than that, that in some weird sense, weird way, they have a moral obligation to participate in that process. One of the consistent warnings that emerges in the biblical writings is warnings against the sin of pride, and the sin of pride is an intellectual sin, and it's associated with the presupposition that you know enough to do without the transcendent. And the biblical stories state very, very clearly, continually, that that is catastrophically dangerous. That you always have to be aware that there's something transcendent that supersedes the domain of your knowledge. And what might you think of people who don't believe that? And, well, they're totalitarians, because they believe that their belief is total. And we know what happens when people become totalitarian. What happens is you get the instant creation of something on earth that very closely resembles hell. And that was hammered home in the 20th century. If you want to derive one lesson from the 20th century, it's that totalitarian states and totalitarian ideologies are not a good way to entrap or search after meaning. That's a mistake. In the Old Testament all the time is that people are making sacrifices to God. And modern people, they have no idea what that, like, why does God want burnt lamb smoke? It's not obvious to modern people, but you know, your ancestors weren't stupid. They were dramatizing something. They were dramatizing this tremendous realization that no other creature has ever managed, which is that there are things you can do to your being that change the nature of reality. And if you do them properly, you can make reality better. It's mind-boggling. And they acted that out because they didn't really understand it. They noticed that if things weren't going right, you had to sacrifice something valuable. And that seemed to make God happy. Well, it might have been a firstborn calf or a firstborn son, for that matter. For modern people, it's more like an idea. You have to sacrifice an idea that you hold dear. in order to progress. Because the ideas that you hold dear are exactly what are making you suffer if you're suffering. So you have to sacrifice them, and then you have to let them go. And the consequence of that is that you enter into this little period of chaos, and then maybe you pop out of that, and that's a good thing. And so, here's an interesting observation. That process of being in a state and identifying an error and correcting it, that's a little death and rebirth. That's like the phoenix. The phoenix dissolves itself into ashes, and then pops back up as a new bird. In the New Testament, there's this weird idea that you have to identify with a person who continually dies and is reborn. Well, what does that mean? It means that the idea that redemption itself is not the consequence of being in a state. It's the consequence of participating in a process. And the process is the willingness to continually have yourself sacrificed, chaotic, and then reborn. And that's what keeps things alive. Now, in the Passion story, there are other elements, and the elements are important. So, for example, the story of Christ is predicated on the assumption that the person who is making the ultimate sacrifices performs a number of acts or undergoes a number of processes, and one is a disciplined apprenticeship. So, for example, in order to have some ideas that you can let go and then reconstitute, you have to have some ideas. You can't just be all chaotic and unformed. And so, in the New Testament, Christ is a master of tradition. He's a master of the law. And you have to be disciplined. You have to be a master of something before you're formed at all. You have to be imbued with the spirit of your ancestors, we'll say. You have to take on that burden. The next idea that underlies the Passion ideas in the New Testament is that the ultimate sacrifice is the sacrifice of yourself to God. Now, that's a very strange idea, and it's a very, very sophisticated idea, because what happens in the Old Testament is there's the constant sacrificing of something else. This requires a different order of being. What does it mean to offer yourself up as a sacrifice to God? Well, offering yourself up as a sacrifice to God is the same thing as determining that your life will be guided by unshakable commitment to the highest good. And what that means is that it's no longer your state that's in charge, or it's no longer your ego that's in charge. It's not even you that's in charge. It means that your conversations with people are no longer going to be about convincing them that your viewpoint is right. And that's not how people live. People live, in a sense, it's like a conniving. And the conniving is a totalitarian conniving. The conniving is an idea that the world should be the way that I want it to be, narrow and totalitarian viewpoint, and then I sacrifice everything to that. And it turns out that that's a very bad idea, because things don't turn out the way I want them to turn out. And the alternative to that, and this is part of what happens in the Sermon on the Mount, which is a very, very strange document, because it represents a transformation from the idea that morality is constituted by adherence to a set of rules to morality being aimed at something that you might think about as more of a positive good. It's not merely not doing what's wrong, it's something else. It's sacrificing yourself in the attempt to make things better. And making things better, not by aiming at what's better, but by telling what's true, and assuming that if you do that, then what's better will happen. Whatever that is, because the thing is, you don't know what's better. You don't have the capacity to fully realize what would constitute better. You pursue the highest good. That's your aim. Your aim determines the world you live in. We know that. That's a fact. That's a psychological fact. What you aim at determines the nature of your world. Well, the Sermon on the Mount says something very interesting. It says, okay, once you get your aim right, and you decide to tell the truth, then all you have to do is concentrate on the day. Now, people read the Sermon on the Mount like it's a hippie document. You know, be like a flower, be like a bird, don't pay any attention to the future, you know, everything will be taken care of. It's not that at all. There's presumptions that are nested in there, and the presumption is, first of all, that you're aiming at perfection. You're aiming at whatever perfection is. And you're not trying to get other people to do that. You're aiming at it. You're reconstituting your actions and your speech to aim at that. And then you do that by noticing very carefully and attending to what constitutes the truth. And then you let that take you wherever it will go. And that's the sacrifice of self to God. Now, I said, right after Adam and Eve's catastrophic emergence into self-consciousness, the world split into two attitudes, one associated with Cain and the other associated with Abel. And that those attitudes are associated with heaven and hell. Do we believe that human beings can turn the world into heaven? Well, that's a harder thing to believe, because there's a lot more ways that things can go wrong than there are ways that things can go right. So heaven's a much narrower thing to aim at than hell, which is a chaotic mess. Well, so then there's another inference in the New Testament. And it's hypothesis of a metastate. And the inference is that a life that's predicated on constant death and renewal at every level of being, a life that's predicated on a search for the truth and an attempt to act out the truth, and a life that's associated with the sacrifice of self to God, produces a state of being that's so deeply meaningful that it justifies suffering. It doesn't eliminate suffering. There's no elimination of suffering. It means that the state of being that's described by the parameters that I already laid out, the willingness to engage in eternal sacrificial death and renewal, and sacrifice of the self to the highest value, produces a state of being, subjectively, that's associated with habitation in the kingdom of God. So why don't they stay in the best possible state? Well, one problem is the commitment of faith, I think. It's very terrifying to let go of the direction of your life and say, well, I'm going to go wherever the attempt to speak the truth will take me. Because God only knows where you're going to end up. And it's certainly not where you think. In fact, the willingness to abandon going to where you think is a prerequisite for doing this. And so in a sense, you're a ship that the wind takes wherever it wants to take. And the second problem, I think, is that it's a real responsibility. Because in order to undertake this process, you have to come to terms with the idea that what you do in your life, your wretched, miserable, tragic, prone life, actually matters. Really, it matters. So, redemption. Well, what does it mean? It means we're not in a state of grace. Why? We're self-conscious. We're aware of the tragedy of our being. We're unwilling to take full responsibility for it, or we're ignorant about how to do that, and that leaves us bereft. How do we solve that? I believe that what is outlined in narrative form in the New Testament is psychologically correct. I believe that the idea that endless micro-death and renewal produces a state of proper adaptation to being. And that the prerequisites for that are laid out in the narrative structure that underlies the New Testament are fundamentally correct. So to be redeemed is to aim at the highest value, to sacrifice what's no longer useful and valid in yourself, and to tell the truth. And the consequence of that is existence in a deep state of meaning that justifies the tragedy of being, and the possibility of transforming your own life in the most beneficial, positive direction, while simultaneously doing that for the people around you. And that's redemption. Thank you very much.